The Alpha King's guard wolf insults everyone non-stop, but I'm the only one who can hear his secret voice. The throne hall smelled like wet dog and old money. Wren had been standing inside the Alpha King's court for 11 minutes, and she already regretted every choice that had brought her here. The scholarship, the transfer paper, the fine print she never read closely enough, the kind that turns diplomatic liaison into the human who carries paperwork for wolves who could snap her spine like a breadstick if they felt like it. Nobody had felt like it yet. That was something. She kept her back straight and her folder pressed to her chest and tried to look like a person who belonged in a room built for creatures twice her size. The ceiling alone made her feel small. Carved beams, iron chandeliers, the kind of architecture meant to remind visitors who was in charge before anyone even spoke a word. Then someone spoke a word. Several words. Loud ones. The guard standing at the left side of the throne was the biggest man in the hall, and that was saying something in a room full of wolves. Silver-furred when he shifted, someone had told her earlier, though right now he stood in human skin, arms crossed, jaw set, mouth already running like it never really stopped. Another human, he said, to nobody in particular, to the room really. Great, we really needed a fresh set of eyes to blink at things. Nobody laughed. Nobody dared. A beta near the wall kept his gaze on the floor like it owed him money. Wren blinked at things. She figured that counted as proof. The guard kept going. He found something wrong with the visiting emissary's shoes. He found something wrong with the weather, which felt unfair, since nobody in the room had personally arranged the weather. He even found something to say about the throne itself, calling it structurally showing off, which made exactly one person in the crowd choke on a laugh and immediately turn it into a cough. Wren started keeping count without meaning to. 4 insults in under 2 minutes, and she hadn't even been formally announced yet. Then his eyes landed on her, and something underneath his voice shifted. Don't look at her. Don't. She heard it clean, like a second sentence sitting right under the first one he was already building. The mean one. The one meant for the room. Out loud he said, and here's the paperwork mule now. Terrifying. And underneath it, in a voice that didn't match his face at all, something closer to panic said the opposite. Nobody else reacted. The beta by the wall didn't flinch. The king on his throne didn't even glance over. Whatever she'd just heard, she'd heard it alone. Her pens chose that exact moment to betray her. The folder in her arms tipped, and a handful of pins slid off her lap. She hadn't even realized she'd sat, some polite instinct pulling her toward an empty bench without permission, and hit the marble floor with a clatter that felt louder than it had any right to be. She went down after them like they were the only stable thing left in the building, crawling under the edge of the dais, under an actual wolf's actual boot, in front of the entire royal court, on her hands and knees, chasing office supplies, because focusing on pins was infinitely more survivable than focusing on the fact that a stranger's inside voice had just spoken directly into her skull. She collects office supplies like they're going to save her, the guard said out loud, to nobody again. Get up, get out of the light. I can't watch this. 2 voices, 1 mouth. She looked up at him from the floor, a pen clutched in each fist like tiny useless weapons, and his face gave her nothing, jaw tight, eyes flat, the exact same contempt he'd handed out to the shoes and the weather and the throne, while the thing underneath it said something that wasn't contempt at all. She heard that. She heard that. She heard that. I heard that, Wren said, out loud, before her brain caught up with her mouth. The room went the specific kind of quiet that comes right before violence, or gossip, or both. The guard's face didn't move. Not a muscle. He was a wall, built by someone who had studied walls for years and then improved on the design. Except walls don't usually run on 2 frequencies at once, and this one did, and the second frequency had just gone completely, screamingly silent, like a man holding his breath underwater and hoping the water doesn't notice. Heard what? He said, flat, almost daring her to answer. Please, please don't. Wren stood, forgetting the rest of her pens entirely, and something in her chest did the thing it always did, right before her worst decisions. Went warm and stupid and forward, like her mouth had its own agenda separate from her survival instincts. "Nothing," she said. "I heard nothing at all." His shoulders dropped, maybe a centimeter. Nobody else in the room would have caught it. She caught it. "Good," he said out loud, cruel as ever. "Keep it that way, paperwork. Thank you." The court moved on around them the way rivers move around a rock. Quick, indifferent, already somewhere else. The king said something about trade routes. Abeda picked a scroll off a side table. Life closed back over the moment like water over a dropped stone, and nobody but Wren seemed to know a stone had been dropped at all. She caught his name an hour later, murmured by a servant with the kind of reverence usually saved for things that could kill you before breakfast. Rurik. She spent the rest of the audience not listening to a single word about trade routes, cataloging instead every insult that left his mouth and the small wrecked thing that lived directly beneath each one, like a second heartbeat nobody else could feel. Don't trust him, he thought, watching a visiting dignitard bow low to the king. Trusted one before. Buried what was left. Not her business, he thought next, catching her watching him again. Not anyone's business. Why can she hear me? That last thought didn't seem aimed at anyone. It just arrived, wide open, and landed in the middle of Wren's chest like a stone. She had no pen, no folder, nothing at all to go chasing after on the floor to distract herself from feeling. She didn't answer, not out loud, and not on whatever silent frequency he was somehow broadcasting on. She filed the thought away instead, the way she filed everything that scared her, carefully, neatly, somewhere she could pretend not to look at later. Court ended eventually. The hall emptied out in slow waves of fur-lined coats and low conversation. Rurik stayed exactly where he'd been standing the whole time, arms crossed, insulting a passing servant's choice of tray on his way out. Stay safe, paperwork. Wren gathered the last of her pens off the marble floor and did not look back at him, and heard him anyway, all the way down the corridor, long after she should have been out of range. The apartment they gave her was small, tucked into the human quarter of the palace grounds, where the ceilings were a normal height and the doors had normal locks. She sat on the edge of the bed that first night with her shoes still on, and tried to decide whether she'd lost her mind or found something rare, and honestly, by the third hour of turning it over in her head, she couldn't tell the difference anymore. She'd read about bonds before taking this job. Everyone who transferred into wolf territory had to sit through the orientation packet, thick as a phone book, half of it legal disclaimers, and half of it folklore dressed up as fact. Fated mates. Pack bonds. The occasional whisper about humans who could hear things they shouldn't, though the packet dismissed those as old stories, the kind grandmothers told to keep children from wandering too close to the woods. She was not a child. She was 26 years old with a student loan balance that could fund a small war, and she had definitely just heard a wolf's inside voice beg her not to say anything in front of an entire royal court. She didn't sleep much that night. She kept replaying it. The mismatch between what his mouth said and what sat underneath it, like two radio stations bleeding into the same signal. Cruel on top, terrified underneath. She wondered which one was the real him, and some small, stubborn part of her already suspected she knew the answer, and didn't like how fast that part had made up its mind. The next morning she was assigned to the record hall, which turned out to be a mercy and a curse in equal measure. A mercy because it kept her far from the throne room, and a curse because it meant hours alone with ledgers and land disputes and absolutely nothing to distract her from thinking about silver eyes and a voice underneath a voice. She lasted 4 days before she saw him again. It happened in a corridor, of all places, an unremarkable stretch of stone between the record hall and the kitchens. She was carrying a stack of folders too tall for her own good, peering around the side of it to make sure she didn't walk into a wall, when she nearly walked into a person instead. She didn't fall this time. That felt like progress. Rurik stood there like he'd been waiting, though she doubted that. More likely he simply took up so much space that any hallway with him in it looked staged. "Watch where you're going," he said, in the same flat, bored tone he used on shoes and weather and thrones. "Some of us would rather not get concussed by government paperwork. I hope she's not overworking herself." She stopped walking, The folders wobbled dangerously in her arms. "I'm fine," she said, answering the second voice instead of the first, and watched something flicker across his face. Not quite surprise, more like a man realizing a trap he'd forgotten he'd set had just gone off under his own feet. "I didn't ask," he said out loud. "You did, though. Just not with your mouth." She hadn't meant to say that last part back to him. Not exactly. But her mouth again had its own opinions on the matter, and what came out was, "You didn't have to ask with your mouth." Silence. The kind with weight to it. A kitchen servant walked past them carrying a tray, glanced between the two of them, and picked up her pace considerably. Rurik's jaw worked once, like he was chewing on several different responses and rejecting all of them. "You should drop those before you break your spine," he finally said, nodding at the folders, and it took her a second to realize this was, by his standards, probably the nicest thing he'd said to anyone all week. He didn't offer to help carry them. She hadn't expected him to. But he did walk beside her for the length of the corridor, insulting the architecture the whole way. Too many pillars, badly proportioned windows, a tapestry he called an insult to thread, and underneath every single complaint ran a second, quieter commentary that had nothing to do with pillars or windows or thread at all. "She's still limping a little from before. Nobody noticed that. I noticed that. Doesn't matter. Not my business. Walk faster, idiot, before someone sees you slowing down for a human." She wasn't limping. She'd twisted her ankle slightly on the first day, stepping wrong off a curb built for creatures with better balance than hers, and she'd forgotten about it entirely until just now, hearing him notice something she herself had stopped noticing. They reached the end of the corridor. He peeled off toward the guard post without another word, out loud or otherwise, and Wren stood there a moment longer than necessary, arms full of folders, feeling like she'd just witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. Weeks passed the way weeks do when you're too busy surviving them to count. Wren learned the palace the way you learn any large, indifferent building, by getting lost in it repeatedly until the wrong turns started to feel familiar. She learned which servants would slip her extra bread if she smiled at them first. She learned which halls got too cold at night. She learned, slowly and against every ounce of good judgment she had left, the particular shape of Rurik's silence. Because that was the thing nobody warned her about in the orientation packet. It wasn't just his stray thoughts she could hear. It was the gaps between them, the moments where his inside voice went quiet on purpose, clamped down hard, like a door being held shut against a storm on the other side. She started noticing when that happened. It happened most around the king. It happened whenever anyone mentioned the northern border. It happened, once, violently, when a passing noblewoman laughed a certain way, high and bright, and Rurik's face didn't change at all, but his inside voice went so silent it felt louder than any insult he'd ever thrown. She didn't ask him about it, not yet. She had a strong suspicion that asking directly would be like reaching into a trap someone else had built a long time ago, one with teeth she couldn't see the size of. Instead, she did something smaller. She started leaving a second cup of tea on the guard post counter in the mornings, next to her own, without comment. The first few days he ignored it entirely, out loud calling it a waste of good ceramic, while his inside voice, quieter, said something closer to "nobody's done that in a long time." By the second week he'd started drinking it before she even arrived. It was a Tuesday, or whatever the Wolf Kingdom's equivalent of a Tuesday was. She'd never quite pinned down their calendar, when the whole fragile arrangement between them nearly came apart. She was crossing the eastern courtyard with an armful of scrolls, actually managing not to drop any of them for once, when she heard raised voices ahead. Not shouting exactly, the kind of tense, controlled volume that meant something serious was happening, and everyone involved was trying very hard to pretend otherwise. A visiting delegation stood near the fountain, wolves from a neighboring territory, their coats a darker shade than anyone in this court wore, their posture stiff with the kind of politeness that's really just aggression wearing a nicer coat. Rurik stood between them and the king's private garden entrance, arms crossed, blocking the path like he'd grown roots there. "The Alpha King extends his hospitality," Rurik was saying, out loud, with none of his usual mockery. not his garden. There's a difference, and you'll find it before you find that gate. Good, good. Keep them out of there. If they see what's in that garden, the thought cut off. Hard. Like static swallowing a radio signal. Wren stopped walking, tucked herself against a pillar, and watched. The lead delegate, an older wolf with pale eyes and the kind of smile that never once reached them, took a step closer to Rurik, close enough that most people would have backed up out of instinct. Rurik didn't move an inch. I was told the Alpha King's guard was decorative, the delegate said, smooth as oil. I see now he's merely rude. Decorative would imply I'm pleasant to look at, Rurik said. I've been informed I'm neither. Turn around. The delegate's smile thinned. For a moment, nobody moved, and the fountain behind them kept splashing away, indifferent to the tension it sat in the middle of, and Wren realized she was holding her breath along with half the courtyard. Then the delegate laughed, a short, humorless sound, and stepped back, gesturing for his party to follow him toward the main hall instead. Another time then, he said, looking forward to it exactly as much as a tax audit, Rurik said, and the delegation swept off, robes and boots clicking against stone, leaving Rurik alone by the gate, with his shoulders still set like he expected an ambush from the flower beds. They can't know. Not yet. Not until it's ready. Wren waited until the courtyard cleared before she approached, scrolls still balanced against her hip, heart going a little faster than the moment probably called for. What's in the garden? She asked, quiet, not really expecting an answer. Rurik's eyes cut to her, sharp enough that she almost took a step back herself. None of your business, he said out loud. If she finds out, she'll be a target too. She can't know, not yet. I wasn't asking to be a target, she said, before she could stop herself, and watched the color actually leave his face for half a second. Not fear exactly, but something close enough to it that she immediately regretted saying it. What did you just say? He said, voice low now, all the mockery gone out of it. Nothing, Wren said quickly, backpedaling the way she should have learned to do weeks ago, and clearly hadn't. I heard nothing. I say that a lot around you. Have you noticed? He stared at her for a long moment. Somewhere behind his eyes, something was working through several conclusions at once, and none of them looked comfortable. I need to talk to her, alone, tonight. Meet me by the old stables after the second bell, he said out loud, gruff, like the words cost him something. Don't tell anyone. Is that an order or an invitation? Wren asked, and immediately wanted to bite her own tongue off for how that sounded out loud. It's a warning, he said, and walked off without waiting for her answer, leaving her standing in the courtyard with an armful of scrolls and a stomach full of something she didn't have a good word for yet. The old stables sat at the far edge of the palace grounds, unused for years according to the servants, kept standing mostly out of some sentimental attachment nobody wanted to explain to a new hire. Wren arrived a few minutes early, out of nerves more than punctuality, and found Rurik already there, leaning against a support beam with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. You're early, he said, not looking at her. You're broadcasting, she said back. Have been for weeks. I didn't ask for it. I don't know how to turn it off. That landed harder than she expected. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched thin enough to hear the wind moving through the old rafters overhead. How long? He asked finally. Since the first day. The throne room. You told yourself not to look at me, and then you looked at me anyway, and I heard both things at once. He exhaled slowly, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten the weight of it. There's a story, he said, about wolves and the humans who can hear us. Not the polished version they hand out in orientation packets. The real one. It only happens between... He stopped himself. Wren waited. The silence stretched again, and this time she could feel the shape of what he wasn't saying, pressing against the edges of it, the way you can feel a held breath in a room, even with your eyes closed. Between mates, he finished, finally, and the word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. It only happens between mates. That's the story, anyway. I always figured it was exactly that. A story. Wren didn't say anything for a long moment. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and went quiet. "That's a big thing to drop on someone in an abandoned stable," she said eventually, mostly because the silence had gotten too loud to sit in any longer. "You're the one who kept hearing me," he said. "I didn't ask for a translator either." "Fair. That's fair. She didn't ask for any of this." "I heard that too," Wren said, and something in his face cracked, just slightly, into the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen on him yet. "Gone almost as fast as it appeared, but there." "This doesn't change anything," he said, out loud, firm. "I still think you're a walking safety hazard with a folder addiction. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to do with you." "Noted," Wren said. "For the record, I think you're the rudest person I've ever met, and also possibly the loneliest, which feels like a strange combination, but here we are." He didn't answer that one, not out loud, and not underneath it either. The silence he gave her instead felt different from his usual silences, not a door held shut against a storm, but something closer to a door left open a crack, testing whether the wind coming through it was safe to let in. They didn't solve anything that night. They didn't need to. Something had simply shifted, quietly, the way tectonic plates shift, invisible from the surface, but the whole landscape different underneath. Over the following weeks, the garden mystery kept circling back, refusing to stay buried the way Rurik clearly wanted it to. Wren caught fragments of it in his silences, a name he wouldn't think all the way through, a memory that flinched shut every time it got close to the surface. She learned not to push. Pushing only made the doors slam harder. Instead she waited, the way you wait out weather, trusting that eventually the pressure would need somewhere to go. It came out on an ordinary evening, which she was starting to realize was how the important things always seemed to happen, not during storms or ceremonies, but in the small, unguarded moments in between. They were in the record hall, of all places, Rurik leaning against a shelf while she sorted land disputes into piles that made sense to nobody but her. He wasn't supposed to be there. Guards didn't usually loiter in record halls, but he'd started finding reasons to, the same way she'd started finding reasons to leave 2 cups of tea instead of 1. "The garden," he said, out of nowhere, like he'd been building up to it for an hour, and finally ran out of runway. "It's not a garden, not really. It's where we bury the ones the border conflicts took, ours and theirs both, if the bodies were ever recovered, which most of them weren't. It's meant to be neutral ground, a place nobody's supposed to touch." His inside voice had gone very quiet, the held breath kind of quiet. "The delegation that came through," he continued, "their pack broke that peace 8 years ago, attacked during a supposed truce meeting. He stopped. Wren set down the scroll she was holding and didn't reach for another one. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to. I've never wanted to before. My brother was in that meeting," he said, out loud this time, steady, like he'd decided to say it properly instead of letting it leak out sideways. "He didn't come back from it. Neither did most of the others. I was supposed to be there too. I switched posts with him that morning, because he had somewhere else to be. Some human girl he was seeing, actually. Off the record, obviously. The kind of thing our kind doesn't exactly announce." The silence in the room went thick and careful, like Wren was standing near the edge of something and needed to watch her footing. "That's why the garden," she said quietly. "That's why the garden," he agreed. "And that's why I don't like delegations from that region standing anywhere near it. And that's why—" He stopped again. This time Wren didn't wait him out. She reached over and put her hand over his, on top of the shelf, light enough that he could pull away if he wanted to. He didn't pull away. Anger's easier, he thought, and this time he let her hear the whole shape of it instead of a fragment. Anger's a tool. It's steady. It doesn't ask anything of you it doesn't already know how to give back. Grief just sits there. Grief doesn't do anything. So I got loud instead. Loud is easier to live inside of than quiet. "I know," Wren said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in her life. "I've been hearing the quiet part under the loud part for weeks. I figured it out eventually." He looked at her for a long moment, silver eyes steady in a way they never were during court, in a way that had nothing performative left in it at all. "This doesn't fix anything," he said finally, out loud, And this time his voice didn't have any bite in it. "It doesn't fix it. But it helps. You help. I didn't expect that. I really didn't expect that. I'm not trying to fix you," Wren said. "I don't think that's my job. I think I just didn't want you carrying all of it alone anymore, since apparently I've got a front row seat to it whether either of us likes it or not." Something in his face loosened, the way a held muscle finally loosens after a long day of being clenched without permission to stop. They didn't kiss that night, though Wren would later admit, mostly to herself, in the privacy of her own small apartment with the normal ceilings and the normal locks, that some part of her had wanted to, and known better than to rush it. Some doors, once opened, need room to swing before anyone walks through them. What happened instead felt smaller and somehow more important. He walked her back to the human quarter afterward, insulting the uneven stones in the courtyard the entire way, out loud, in the old familiar tone, and underneath every complaint ran something warmer than she'd heard from him before. "I'll walk her every night if she'll let me. I don't care how many times I have to complain about stones to make it look normal. You know I can hear that part too," Wren said, smiling despite herself. "I'm aware," he said. "I've decided I don't mind as much as I used to." Word about the two of them spread slowly, the way it does in any place where people have too much time and too little to talk about. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody would have dared, not with Rurik standing guard most days looking like a thundercloud that had learned to walk. But Wren noticed the glances in the dining hall, the way conversations dipped a fraction when she walked past, the way one particular noblewoman started finding excuses to linger near the record hall doorway with a smile that never once reached her eyes. Her name was Yselde, and she'd been, according to the kitchen staff who gossiped freely once they decided they liked you, close with Rurik once, years back, before whatever had happened between them had curdled into something neither side ever discussed in public. Wren met her properly for the first time on a morning she'd rather forget. She was crossing the courtyard with a stack of border maps under one arm when Yselde fell into step beside her, uninvited, moving with the kind of easy grace that made Wren instantly aware of every awkward thing her own body was doing. "You're the human he walks home," Yselde said. "Not a question. I'm the human who works in the record hall," Wren said carefully. "The walking home is incidental." Yselde smiled, thin and polite. "Nothing about Rurik is incidental. He doesn't do things by accident. He decides, and then he commits, and then he insults everyone who points out that he's decided. It's very tiresome to watch, honestly, unless you're the one he's decided about. Then I imagine it's something else entirely." There was no venom in her voice, which somehow made it worse. Wren kept walking, kept her chin level, and said nothing, because she'd learned by now that the safest response to a trap baited with silence was more silence. "Be careful with him," Yselde said finally, right before she peeled off toward the eastern wing. "Not because he'll hurt you, because he won't let himself need anything twice. Once was already more than he could survive. I'd know." Wren thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. She didn't ask Rurik about Yselde directly. Some doors, she was learning, needed to be found rather than forced. But she noticed, after that, how carefully he never mentioned her at all, which felt like its own kind of answer. It came up anyway, eventually, the way most things did between them, sideways, in a quiet moment neither of them had planned for. They were up on the old eastern wall one evening, a spot Rurik had shown her weeks earlier, technically off-limits to human staff but apparently not off-limits enough to stop him from taking her there whenever the weather cooperated. The sun was going down over the training yards, throwing long orange light across the stones, and for once his running commentary had gone quiet, which she'd learned to recognize as its own kind of statement. "Yselde talked to you," he said finally, not looking at her. "She did. What did she say?" Wren considered how to answer that honestly without turning it into a weapon. "She said you don't let yourself need things twice." He was quiet for a long moment, jaw working the way it did when he was deciding whether a thought was safe to let out into the open air. She wasn't wrong, exactly, he thought, and this time he let her hear the whole of it instead of a fragment. "I needed something once. It went badly. Not the way my brother's story went. Nobody died, nothing that dramatic, but it taught me the same lesson from a different direction. Wanting things makes you soft in places you can't afford to be soft. So I stopped. Made a whole personality out of stopping, if you want the truth. That sounds exhausting, Wren said. It was efficient, he said out loud, and she caught the small wry twist at the corner of his mouth that told her he knew exactly how thin that defense sounded now that he'd said it. Then why does it feel different with her? Why does efficient feel like the wrong word entirely now? I heard that, Wren said softly. I know you did, he said. I've mostly stopped trying to hide it from you. Turns out that's a losing fight. They sat there a while longer, the sun sliding the rest of the way down behind the training yards, neither of them in a hurry to be anywhere else. It wasn't a confession exactly, what passed between them that evening. It was smaller than that, and somehow sturdier, two people quietly agreeing, without saying it outright, that whatever this was, they were both willing to keep finding out. Not everyone in the palace was so patient with the arrangement. A week later, Wren found a note slipped under her apartment door, unsigned, written in a careful hand that told her whoever sent it had taken real time over it. It didn't threaten her, not exactly. It simply reminded her, in polite, looping script, that humans who got too close to wolf business had a way of becoming problems that solved themselves, and that she should consider, for her own good, spending less time near the guard post. She didn't tell Rurik at first. She told herself it was nothing. Palace politics, someone jealous of the extra tea, someone with too much time and not enough to occupy it. But she kept the note, folded small, at the bottom of her folder, the same place she kept everything she wasn't ready to look at directly. He found out anyway, 3 days later, the way he found out most things, by noticing the shape of what she wasn't saying. They were in the record hall again, the closest thing either of them had to a shared territory, when he set down the scroll he'd been pretending to read and looked at her properly. Something's wrong, he said out loud. You've been chewing on it for days. What is it? Nothing. It's nothing. I'll figure out how to ask without sounding like I'm accusing her of hiding things. You're already accusing me of hiding things, Wren said, tired enough by then that she didn't have the energy to dance around it. You might as well just ask, he asked. She told him and pulled the note out of the bottom of her folder to prove it, and watched his face do something she'd never seen it do before. Not the flat mask he wore for court, not the wry half-smile he'd started giving her privately, but something colder and more exposed, the look of a man realizing a threat had gotten closer to something he cared about than he'd allowed for. Give me the note. I need the note. She handed it over. He read it twice, jaw tight, and when he spoke again his voice had lost every trace of its usual mockery. I'm going to find out who wrote this, he said. It could be nothing, Wren said, though even she didn't fully believe it anymore. It's not nothing. Nothing doesn't make my hands want to break something. This is not nothing. It took him 4 days. Wren never learned the full details of how, some combination of guard instinct and quiet, patient asking around that he clearly hadn't wanted her present for. But the answer, when it came, surprised neither of them as much as it probably should have. A junior clerk in the record hall, resentful over a passed-over promotion, had decided the fastest way to make his displeasure known was to target the human he blamed, unfairly and without much logic, for taking up space he felt entitled to. It wasn't the grand conspiracy either of them had half braced for. It was smaller and pettier than that, the way most cruelty in close quarters usually is. Not a villain with a master plan, just a person too small to handle his own disappointment gracefully. The clerk was reassigned to a distant outpost within the week, quietly, without ceremony, and the palace moved on the way palaces do, forgetting minor scandals almost as fast as they manufacture them. But something had shifted between Wren and Rurik in those 4 days, something that didn't shift back once the danger passed. He walked her home every night without pretending it was incidental anymore. He stopped performing his usual insults quite as hard when she was in earshot, not because he'd run out of complaints about the architecture, but because some of the old armor had simply stopped feeling necessary around her. The delegation returned a few weeks later, sooner than anyone expected, and with less patience than they'd shown the first time. Word moved through the palace fast, the way it always did, servants whispering it kitchen to corridor to record hall, until Wren heard it secondhand from a girl restocking ink. The northern pack wanted the garden opened, wanted their dead exhumed and returned, or wanted something else entirely, depending on which version of the rumor you believed. Rurik went quiet, in a way Wren hadn't heard from him since the stables. Not the held-breath quiet. Something steadier, more prepared, like a man checking the locks on a door he already knew wouldn't hold if someone leaned hard enough. She found him at the guard post that evening, tea untouched beside him for the first time in weeks. "Talk to me," she said. "They want an audience with the king. Tomorrow. If it goes wrong, there won't be a garden left standing to argue over." "It's tomorrow," he said out loud, "and I'd like you nowhere near the throne room when it happens." "That's not really your call," Wren said, gentler than the words probably deserved. "I work here too. You could get hurt. I can't watch that happen. Not again. Not someone else." "I heard that," she said, quieter now. "And I'm still going to be there, because hiding in the record hall isn't going to make either of us safer, and you know that better than I do." He didn't argue further, though she could feel him wanting to, the argument sitting right under his silence like a held breath he'd decided, finally, not to release. The next day's audience was tense, in a way the first delegation visit hadn't been. The Northern Pack's leader stood taller this time, spoke louder, made a case for the garden that sounded reasonable on the surface and threatening underneath, the way water sounds calm, right up until you notice the current pulling at your ankles. The king listened, weighed, asked careful questions. Rurik stood at his post the entire time, silent in every way that mattered, jaw set, eyes tracking every movement in the room like a man cataloging exits. Wren stood near the back with her folder, technically there for record-keeping, actually there because leaving him alone in that room had felt, the moment she considered it, like the wrong thing to do. The tension broke not with violence in the end, but with words. Careful, exhausting, hours of them, until the Northern Pack's leader finally agreed to a compromise neither side loved but both could live with. A formal memorial, built jointly, replacing the quiet, unmarked garden with something both packs could visit without pretending grief stopped at a border. It wasn't closure exactly. Wren doubted anything ever really was. But it was something, and something was more than the silence had offered for 8 years. The memorial itself was built over the following months, stone by stone, both packs sending workers to lay it side by side, which struck Wren as its own small miracle every time she walked past the site on her way to the record hall. It wasn't finished quickly. Grief that old doesn't rush for anyone, and neither pack seemed inclined to pretend otherwise. But something had cracked open that hadn't been open in 8 years, and cracks, she was learning, were sometimes exactly where the light got in. Rurik visited the site most evenings, alone at first, and then, once he stopped pretending he didn't want the company, with Wren beside him. He never said much while they stood there. He didn't need to. She'd learned to read the shape of his silence the way other people read weather, and this particular silence had softened over the weeks from something jagged into something almost peaceful, like a wound finally scarring over, instead of just scabbing. "I used to come here angry," he told her one evening, watching the workers lay the last of the border stones in the fading light. "Every single time, I'd stand right here and feel it building up in my chest, like something with claws, and I'd go pick a fight with the nearest inanimate object just to have somewhere to put it. I don't feel that anymore, not the same way. I don't know exactly when that changed. I think I know when," Wren said quietly. He looked at her, and for once he didn't deflect it with an insult about the weather, or the stones, or anything else within reach. "Yeah," he said, "I think you probably do." Court life didn't stop just because Wren's personal world had quietly rearranged itself. If anything, it got busier. The memorial negotiations opened a door to broader trade talks, and broader trade talks meant more scrolls, more disputes, more hours in the record hall squinting at handwriting, clearly designed by someone who hated whoever eventually had to read it. She didn't mind, mostly. The work had a rhythm to it now, a place inside her days that felt less like surviving a strange new world and more like actually living in one. The court, for its part, had mostly stopped whispering about her and Rurik by then, not because the whispering had run its course exactly, but because a human liaison who quietly helped broker peace over an 8-year-old wound made for a much less interesting scandal than one who was simply, embarrassingly, being courted by the Alpha King's guard. People, it turned out, could get bored of gossip if you gave them something more useful to talk about instead. Iselda found her again, weeks later, in the same courtyard where their first conversation had happened. This time, there was no thin, polite smile waiting. She looked, if anything, tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting part of it down. "I owe you an apology," Iselda said, without preamble. "What I said before, it wasn't really about you. It was about a version of him I used to know, and I was angry that version never let me in, and I took some of that out on you unfairly. You didn't deserve that." Wren considered her for a moment. "You weren't entirely wrong, though. He does have trouble letting people in." "He does," Iselda agreed. "But I've watched him this past season. Whatever door you found, it wasn't the one I was knocking on. I think, honestly, it's good he found someone who could actually hear him instead of just guessing at what was underneath all that noise he makes." A small, real smile this time. "That's more than I ever managed." It wasn't friendship exactly, what grew between them after that conversation, more like a truce between two people who'd both, in their own ways, tried to reach the same locked door, and only one of them had found the right key. But it was enough. Wren found she didn't need every relationship in this strange new life to be simple. She just needed the important ones to be honest, and that one finally was. Rurik found her afterward in the corridor outside, still holding her folder like a shield out of habit more than need. "You stayed," he said out loud. "I didn't want to do that alone. Turns out I didn't have to. I told you I would," Wren said. He looked at her for a long moment, the corridor quiet around them, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. "For the record," he said finally, "I still think you're a walking safety hazard." "For the record," she said, "I still think you're the rudest person I've ever met." "Good. Keep thinking that. It's easier than the other thing I want you to think." "I heard that too," Wren said, smiling now, unable to help it. "I know," he said, and for the first time since the throne room, he didn't try to take it back. Months slipped by, the way months do, once you stop counting them out of nerves and start counting them out of habit. Instead, autumn folded into winter, and the palace grounds turned the kind of gray-white that made the record hall feel almost cozy, all those old stone walls finally earning their keep by keeping the wind out. Wren stopped thinking of her apartment in the human quarter as temporary housing and started thinking of it as home, which surprised her more than almost anything else that had happened since she'd arrived. She still dropped pens. She'd stopped being embarrassed about it somewhere around the 3rd month, mostly because Rurik had taken to catching them out of the air before they hit the floor, a small unconscious reflex he never commented on and she never pointed out, because some kindnesses worked better left unnamed. The court, too, had settled into something steadier. The northern delegation visited twice more that winter, and both times the meetings were almost boring, which Wren had learned to recognize as the highest compliment diplomacy could pay itself. Boring meant nobody was bleeding. Boring meant the memorial was doing exactly what it was built to do. Rurik still insulted everyone who crossed his path. That hadn't changed, and Wren had stopped expecting it to. Had, if she was honest, grown rather fond of it, the way you grow fond of weather patterns, particular to wherever you've decided to put down roots. He told a visiting merchant his cart smelled like regret. He informed a new recruit that his salute looked like a man swatting at a bee. He once spent a full 5 minutes explaining to the head cook, with total sincerity, that a particular soup was an act of culinary hostility, and the cook had laughed so hard she'd had to sit down. But Wren heard the second voice now more often than she heard silence, and that, more than anything, told her how far they'd come. The held-breath quiet that used to follow him everywhere had thinned out into something closer to peace. Not gone entirely, because grief like his didn't simply vanish because a season changed, but no longer running the show underneath everything he did. One evening in early winter, he walked her home the long way, past the memorial, which had finally been finished a few weeks prior, a low stone wall circling a quiet garden, both packed sigils carved side by side above the gate, simple and steady, in a way that felt earned rather than decorative. Snow had started to fall, light and unhurried, catching in his dark hair and on her eyelashes, and for once, he didn't fill the silence with complaints about the weather. "I used to think this place would always feel like a wound," he said, watching the snow settle over the new stones. "I think I forgot that wounds are also just where the healing happens, eventually, if you let them. I wasn't sure I'd ever let anything heal. Then paperwork happened to my life, and ruined all my plans to stay miserable forever." "I heard that," Wren said, laughing despite the cold, "and I choose to take it as a compliment." "It was meant as one," he said, and reached over, without any of his usual bluster, to brush a bit of snow from her shoulder, his hand lingering there a moment longer than the task strictly required. "For what it's worth, I don't think I ever properly said thank you. For hearing me, for not running when the hearing got complicated." "You did say it," Wren said softly, "the very first day. Under all that noise about paperwork and terrifying humans, I just don't think either of us knew yet what we were actually thanking each other for." He looked at her for a long moment, snow gathering quietly on the stones around them, on the low garden wall built by two packs who'd finally learned to grieve the same loss together instead of apart, and something in his expression settled into place the way the last piece of a puzzle settles, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, finally, correct. "For the record," he said, voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, "I still think you're a walking safety hazard." "For the record," Wren said, stepping closer, close enough now that she didn't need to raise her voice at all, "I still think you're the rudest, loneliest, most impossible man I have ever met." Good, he thought, and this time there was no static in it, no held breath, no door slammed shut against a storm. Just the words, plain and steady and entirely his own. "Keep thinking that. It's still easier than the other thing." "I heard that too," she whispered. "I know," he said, and this time, instead of pulling the words back the way he always used to, he simply let them stand there in the falling snow between them, unguarded, uncomplicated, entirely true, and for the first time since she'd arrived at a palace that smelled like wet dog and old money, Wren understood that some things really were better left unexplained. You didn't need a footnote for a thing you could finally fully hear. Word about the two of them spread through the palace properly not long after that, the way real things always eventually do, quieter and steadier than any rumor had managed. Nobody made much of a fuss over it in the end. The kitchen staff smiled a little wider when Wren came through for tea. The record hall clerk stopped raising eyebrows when Rurik showed up with no official reason to be there. Even the king, on one of his rare visits to the eastern courtyard, paused long enough to observe, dryly, that his most insufferable guard had somehow become slightly less insufferable, which the whole court agreed was as close to a blessing as anyone was likely to get out of him. Wren never did find a tidy explanation for why she, out of every human who'd ever passed through that palace, was the one who could hear him. The old stories called it a bond between mates and left it there, offering no further footnotes, and after everything, she'd decided she didn't need one either. Some things you don't explain, you just listen, carefully, for as long as it takes, and trust that the person underneath the noise is worth the listening. She still kept a folder of pens on her at all times. Old habits, it turned out, didn't need fixing just because the fear underneath them had finally eased. And every morning, without fail, she left 2 cups of tea on the guard post counter instead of 1, not because anyone had asked her to anymore, but because some mornings, the smallest, quietest kindnesses are the ones that end up building an entire life around them, 1 cup at a time.